Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Farrell, and it's a very great pleasure to join you here in El Paso, which is an interesting place to hold the discussion on the border. I want to take a special moment to thank Dr. Orient and also all of you for inviting me back out to speak. Last time I spoke to your organization was in Las Vegas a few years ago. Sadly, I am not a doctor. I'm neither a medical doctor nor a PhD. But I am smart enough to bring along my very own PhD, and that's Dr. Shay Bradley-Farrell, my wife, my partner, and she's going to be briefing sort of the second part of this discussion of the view from the border. There's a lot to discuss. There's all the issues of border security, there's illegal immigration, there's national security questions. There's a lot of different things to look at and talk about concerning the border. And what I hope to do, and I think Dr. Shay will hope to do, is to really provoke the hell out of you. I want to motivate you and get all the little gray cells percolating, and I want to answer questions. So I'll talk for a few minutes. I'll hand it off to Shay, and then I want to leave time for questions, because I think some of the stuff we're going to discuss is provocative enough and jarring enough that you're going to want to say, hey, wait a minute, what about, well, how come, well, where did you get? And I'll tell you that everything that we have to present to you as far as stats and figures and facts, they're all grounded in documentation. So none of this is speculative opinion stuff. It's all grounded in either U.S. government records or other publications. Some of the things we want to talk about, of course, is the current state of the U.S. border, the ongoing crises and attacks that the country faces because of the situation on the border. It's interesting that you're here in El Paso, because El Paso happens to be the hub of a narco-terror plot that was the subject of a 7-year-long investigation by Judicial Watch. It's the subject of a documentary film that I'll show you a quick little 2-minute trailer of called The Sun City Cell. And the objective was to do a truck bombing attack in Chicago, to blow up the Sears Tower, now called the Willis Tower, and also to blow up Oprah Winfrey's studios. And sometimes when I say that, people applaud. So El Paso was and is a nest of corruption. There is a very thin veneer of civility and law enforcement. El Paso advertises itself as the safest city in America. And that thin veneer of civility and law enforcement is maintained because the bad guys don't want to draw attention to themselves. If you think about El Paso and the El Paso region, the border region of Texas, nuts, pecans. If you think about citrus and you associate that with Florida, nuts, pecans, etc., are the agribusiness industry here along the border in Texas. It's enormous. Science has yet to devise a tool or a machine that can shell a pecan, or pecan as used to call it in New York City. So science has yet to devise a machine that can shell a pecan. So literally, trees are shaken, pecans are gathered up, they're stuffed in 2,000-pound bags, they're driven across the border into Mexico where all the handwork is done. Then all those nuts are gathered back up, shipped back across the border. So those 2,000-pound These 2,000-pound bags go back and forth across the border day in, day out from November to April every year. What do you think you can move in those 2,000-pound bags and in those truckloads of 2,000-pound bags? You can move anything you want, right? Drugs, guns, money, people, whatever it is, you can move it. Agribusiness, in particular in El Paso with respect to pecans and other nuts, is an incredibly large and wealthy business. So those bags go back and forth across the border with anything and everything under the sun in it. There's some very wealthy agribusiness people here in El Paso in particular. I'm not going to use names in this instance, but trust me, if you need me to give you the names, I can tell you. They're two brothers. They own a number of farms here. And I always think of them as sort of the they're the Sinaloa cartel's embassy in El Paso. And they're very nice guys, and they're very wealthy guys, and they dress nicely, and they participate in the local community. They go to all the Chamber of Commerce meetings. They write checks to the hospital, to the kids' boys club, to whatever it is. They're very nice, very influential, very charming people. But that's their business, is to be that kind of person in the community. And so guys like that have a tendency to want to help out local politicians that are running for office. And those same people not only have business interests here in El Paso and Texas, but they also have other properties in Arizona and elsewhere. And so if you're a local politician looking to run for government office, and this is where the public corruption aspect comes in, let's say you want to run to become district attorney. Well, it sure would help to have a check for $10,000 or $20,000 just to help the cause, right? Maybe $30,000, $40,000. And so guess what? These guys write checks and you win your contest, your election, and you become the district attorney. Well, then you say, well, you know, maybe I want to be governor. And that person runs for governor, and they rely on the financial support of the guys that I call the embassy of the Sinaloa cartel. And they run a gubernatorial campaign, and they take checks, and that person becomes governor. And so let's say you want to run for governor, and you rely on these same guys to write checks to you, and you end up becoming governor. And then eventually down the road, a few years later, another candidate wins the presidency, and they need a new Homeland Security director. Well, what better than a governor of a border state who's been a DA and an attorney general, and then Janet Napolitano becomes Secretary of Homeland Security. This is not fantasy. This is the facts of life on the border, and that's how these things occur. But I'll give you an example, again, of some El Paso corruption, and that's just one small example, but we'll discuss the narco-terror plot. Then Dr. Shay is going to hop up here, and she's going to talk about some underreported lessons of the border and talk about Vision 2025, which is Vision 2025 is, okay, you told us how bad it is, you told us how crazy and screwed up it is, now what are you going to do to fix it, right? It's easy to talk about problems, let's talk about solutions, and Dr. Shay will do that. So the context for all this reporting is that I've been messing around one way or another professionally on borders of different types for 41 years. So as a freshly minted second lieutenant at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, we were worried then about Soviet Spetsnaz soldiers and Chinese PLA soldiers crossing the border. That's 1983 in the Huachuca Mountains of southeast Cochise County in Arizona. That was the worry then. I've then worked on borders in East-West Germany, East and West Berlin, in Panama, where the Colombian FARC operatives were shuttling drugs. Now it's very popular to talk about the Darien Gap and Darien Peninsula of Panama. I was running around there doing stuff in the early 90s. I've been to Guatemala and Honduras. I marched along with the caravanners. Remember that around 2017, 2018? So instead of sitting in a studio talking about it in New York or DC, we went out and committed an act of journalism and went on the ground in Guatemala, marched along with them, interviewed them, photographed them, did shot video. The biggest lesson for me in marching along in Guatemala with the caravanners was that whenever you saw imagery on television, you saw crying women and children. Well, 99% of the people marching along in Guatemala and Honduras were military-age males, 15 to 50. Now, when I pulled the camera out, guess who came running to the front? Guess who was actually pushed and prodded to get out in front of when I pulled the camera out? Women and children. Because that's the imagery that is, conveyed or broadcast to the American public. I had my very own Logan Act violation, I say that jokingly, in Guatemala. The Republic of Guatemala, awarded me their intelligence star for my work in Guatemala, trying to uncover what was going on. So I have a lot of experience on borders. And then for the last 20 some odd years, working specifically on the border with the interests of Judicial Watch and trying to get our message out to the public. So borders have some characteristics about them that are they seem self-evident, but it's worth saying them out loud. They're international contact points, right? They define the identities and differences between two countries. They're often very unforgiving. Borders are not nice places. Even in friendly countries, when they abut one another, borders involve paramilitary force, right? Some type of police agency is guarding, watching, checking, evaluating. It's a contact point. It's a point of friction. And those dividing lines that are often places that people, not necessarily here, with like Canada, but certainly when it comes to Mexico and in other places around the world, these are places that people are willing to either die for to get there or to kill for to protect it. And that's kind of the prism, I think, to look at all borders with. And the border disputes themselves obviously are as old as human history. Currently, our border is a place of murder and enslavement, torture, rape, and other inhumane acts. I cannot convey to you, Dr. Shay will, but I cannot convey to you how insanely brutal the current situation on the border is. So I've been doing it for Judicial Watch for 21 years, looking at the border. Lots of other experiences. I was at OP Alpha in Germany, where a dad threw his son over the fence outside of a little town called Rasdorf, and the East Germans machine gunned that 6-year-old boy and left him in the wire at Christmas, right? That, as horrific as that is, and it is horrific, that is nothing compared to what is going on day in and day out on our southern border, right now. So, some of the key takeaways that I want you to, if there's nothing else you get, the cartels control our southern border. Nothing crosses that border. People, contraband, nothing crosses the border without Mexican cartels getting a piece of the action, a percentage, one way or the other. Cartels have killed far more Americans than any foreign terrorist organization or any other armed military force in the last 50 years. We're going to talk about fentanyl in a little while, and those numbers are jarring or shocking. In the Trump era, 11 migrants were arrested by the Border Patrol for being on the terrorist screening database. Take a guess what the current number is. 377. So this is a wildly exponential increase, because when you kick the door open, guess who decides to come in? So the Biden administration is currently saying, hey, we've got 40% fewer border crossings, and they're thrilled with that, but it's a very misleading, disingenuous kind of stat, because a lot of times people entering the country unlawfully are using an app, CBP1. Hopefully some of you have heard of that. It's actually an app on your phone where you can say, hey, look, I know I'm actually not allowed to lawfully enter the United States, but I'd like to fly into Atlanta. Will you let me? And you can apply using this app and fly into the country, even though normally you would not be allowed lawfully to enter, to be permitted. There's some numbers there. 413,000 entries as of May. Last year in total it was 430, so we're operating at almost double the rate, roughly speaking. And in the prior years, 173,000. Back in 21, it was 75,000. These are crazy. These are entry points over land. These are people that pull up to Nogales, Arizona, or San Diego and say they want to enter the country, and they're allowed to enter. That's in addition to another 70 or 80,000 who are on a humanitarian parole, and then 30,000 that are being paroled in because they keep changing the rules on parole. Most recent change is if you've been married to an American for 10 years and you've kept your nose clean, you can become a citizen. That was actually something that was originated or started for military family members who married a foreign national. But they then switched it around to make it eligible for anybody and everybody, not just folks who are in the military. So 194 known terror suspects so far, 377 total. Special interest aliens, those are people who come from countries that are specially designated as being a terror threat to us. 74,000, almost 75. We talked about the aliens being flown in between January 23rd and March 24th. It's 500,000 people, more than 500,000. And I don't necessarily respect Michael Morrell for a variety of reasons, but one thing is interesting is that as a former CIA director or deputy director, even he admits that our vulnerability at the southern border is at a blinking red light phase. There's sporadic reporting. Every once in a while, the media will sort of commit an act of, they'll commit the truth. So some of you may have watched President Biden over the last few years and said, wow, he's not looking too good. Gee, he seems a little awkward, or maybe he's not really hitting on all cylinders physically or otherwise. And then suddenly he does a 90-minute debate and everyone's hysterical that he's not 100%. I think people kind of knew that. This is the same kind of thing. This is a case where our southern border has gone to hell in a handbasket, and only occasionally do you get periodic reporting of, hey, look, gee whiz, the cartels are brutal. Or, gee, there's modern-day slavery going on in the country. Or, in this case, Newsweek reports 85,000 undocumented children have gone missing. So ORR is the Office of Refugee Resettlement. They're responsible for taking care of kids, unaccompanied minors who arrive in the country. And in this case, ORR is engaged in really a human trafficking operation because they're letting kids be picked up by friends and family, and they don't really know where they're going. Or in instances where they have tracked the registered address, it's an apartment that has 8 families registered there and 60 some odd children in a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment. There's a very brave woman named Tara Reed Rodas, R-O-D-A-S, who I've interviewed. You can see my interview over on our Judicial Watch website. But she's spoken before Congress. She actually comes out of the Inspector General community, and she volunteered to go down to one of these processing points outside of San Diego. And she's the one that blew the whistle on this. But our United States government, this 85,000 number by now is 100,000, maybe 125. No one really knows. The important thing is the government has facilitated and sponsored these children being resettled in the United States, and no one knows where they are. They're gone. No less than the New York Times did a 3-part series on child labor in the United States over the last 3 years. It's a very disturbing series of articles, and I encourage you to look at those or to read them. Right here in El Paso, back in March, some very fine reporting by Jenny Tare, who I recommend to you as a reporter from the New York Post. You probably saw this imagery, but let's see what really happened. So arguably, we've lost control of our southern border, and that's right here in El Paso. What do you think happened to the guys who did that? So they broke through the border, assaulted our troops, rushed to the second line. What do you think the consequences were for them? Dozens were violently stormed the El Paso border crossing, were released into the U.S. They were released. Dozens of the people that you just saw. In this case, we did some reporting and uncovered that more than 200,000 deportation cases were simply dismissed. The people don't even have a notice to appear or have any obligation to report themselves. They've already been allowed into the country, but the Homeland Security, whoops, they missed the paperwork deadline, dismissed the case. So they're here. We're also creating an official second-class citizenship in the United States. We have enough problems to begin with, just operating as a country. What we don't need to do is have an official second-class citizenship where people running around, pretending, hiding, and that's what we're doing when we create these conditions. This is very busy and probably very tough to read, but I guess the important thing I'll highlight for you is there are countries that are designated as hostile to the United States. They're not too tough to figure out. I'll run through some of the numbers. But even those countries that are hostile to the United States, when they show up here and they ask to enter the country, many, many, many are released. So in the case of countries like Venezuela, 97% released. Russian nationals, 94% released. Uzbek nationals, 82% released. Belarusian nationals, 98% released. Afghan nationals, 93%. Chinese nationals, 88%. Iranian nationals, 88%. These are people that when they appear, and they're admitting that they're here unlawfully and that they want entry anyway. And what happens is the Border Patrol processes them, which basically says, hey, what's your name? Okay, thank you. And they let them go. These are the numbers that we're dealing with or having to wrestle with. So this is a very deliberate thing. It's systematic. It's not an accident. It's not a whoopsie, gee, we could have done it better. This is a deliberate deconstruction of our immigration and security policies and laws. It's also incredibly abusive at the human rights level. I mean, the circumstances and conditions are such that the only way that you could support this is if you believe that more women should be exploited. More children should be exploited. You know, the environment and the circumstances that Shay will talk about are so severe. How could anyone willingly, knowingly say, yeah, we got to have more of this. This is the best thing going. If we exploit more children and women, this will really be great for America. But that's what we're faced with. It's not a policy dispute. It's not the two parties arguing over a tax rate, right? That's a policy dispute. This is a law enforcement and national security issue that is beyond any challenge we've ever faced as a country. It's also the greatest sort of forced migration or mass migration aside from the 1947 split between India and Pakistan. They had 14 million officially move in that particular crisis. You know, you can argue that there's upwards of 16 million, maybe more, that have moved in the last 3 years into the United States. So the official numbers are 7.2 million, but they also acknowledge that there's an additional 1.8 million that law enforcement knows got away, meaning they showed up on a camera or on a sensor or through video surveillance, but there was no law enforcement to pick them up. And they're just in the interior of the United States doing whatever it is they want to do. So charitably, 7.2, 1.8, that's 9 million. That's more than the population of 36 of our 50 states. So just round figures, Virginia is 7 million. So you've just imported or just brought in another Virginia. So 16 to 18 million people, that's a ballpark. No one really knows. The United States government has no idea who's in the country. None. That's a screen art from an article I did, which suggested that Biden really, this is a human rights violation on a scale we've never seen. Very proudly, if you look at the date, January 20th, 2021, the Biden administration was thrilled to announce that they were rolling back all kinds of stuff that Trump had put in place. No wall, protections for DACA recipients, rolling back other immigration policies. But at the same time, there's a certain schizophrenia here, where they know that they're releasing and knocking down rules and regulations, but they'll decry law breaking. So Justice Department says, oh gee, Sinaloa cartel is very dangerous. Biden and AMLO discussed fentanyl and migration during their San Francisco meeting. First of a kind campaign for unprecedented scale to foil human smuggling network. So all these programs are announced, but there's very little actually done. Right? That's like the executive order that said dial back the number of people allowed into the country that was made about 3 weeks ago. And they'll report, 40% drop. But they're not telling the rest of the story. They're not giving you the fact that 500,000 are flying into the country. I talked about El Paso. I talked about the Sun City cell. Hopefully you can see this.
Planning further terror attacks against the United States.
Al-Qaeda has a senior operative that is so familiar with America.
And they don't know where he is.
In 2009, 2 top Al-Qaeda operatives planned a terror attack from inside the United States.
Shukr Juma, who they also called the pilot, literally was a pilot who was flying into and out of a small private airfield in Anthony, New Mexico, called Cielo Dorado.
So if I fly an airplane in from Mexico, where's the customs?
There's none. It simply doesn't exist.
Narco-terror ring.
The exclusive story of Al-Qaeda's narco-terror plot to strike America's heartland.
2 guys who are on the FBI's most wanted list were meeting with guys in Anthony, New Mexico, of all places, and targeting the city of Chicago for truck bombs, looking to blow up Oprah Studios and the Sears Tower.
And a web of corruption that continues to leave America vulnerable.
There's some connection with the FBI and the federal government with Iraq. Like I said, you've got a get out of jail free card.
Anybody else would be charged with engaging in terrorist activity and locked up for the rest of their lives.
Our sources risk their lives for the truth.
What's the downside of talking to us? Why is this such a difficult story to tell?
What you have here along the border, you have cartels, you have corrupt law enforcement, you have terrorists, and any one of those three groups could turn on a dime and kill you, kill your family.
So is El Paso, for lack of a better term, a narco-terror cell in the United States?
Yes.
No doubt.
No doubt.
This summer, For the Record and Judicial Watch bring you the Sun City Cell.
These are real threats. This is not make-believe. So that came out a couple of years ago. I'm not going to belabor this, but all the places on this map that you're looking at, Cielo Dorado up at the top, that's the private airfield where ISIS operatives were flying in and out of. This yellow streak where it says Donovan Road is where there's a string of used car dealerships, U-Pullet junkyards, and a bunch of other businesses that are used as commercial fronts for Islamist supremacist militants. That's where they would meet and organize and train to conduct this bombing activity. The Santa Teresa crossing point out to the west is a truck crossing point, but there's an insane amount of illegal activity and traffic there. In Anapra, Juarez, Mexico, just to the east of that, we found out from an investigation of 2 sources, both Mexican, one Army, one police, that ISIS operatives were in Anapra. The only reason they found out about it is because the incredibly corrupt Mexican police and incredibly corrupt Mexican army were fighting over who was going to pay shakedown money, and they didn't know who these 2 guys were. They were the 2 guys that, hey, do you got them? No, we thought he was yours. No, he's ours? No, you got him. And that's how they identified who the guys were. Waterfill Street in Juarez, Mexico, down near their airport, is home to a Hezbollah counterfeiting operation. There's a lot of problems with El Paso, and I could go on, but I won't because I want to get to our next portion of discussion. And that has to do with some underreported lessons. So I'm going to invite Dr. Shay Bradley-Farrell to come on up and do the second part of our presentation here, and then we'll take questions.
I want to share with you, first of all, just so you know who I am. I work in foreign policy and national security in DC. I'm president of a think tank called Counterpoint Institute. And I like to say we do sit around in DC and write good policy papers, but that's not all we do. We go to where the problem is, such as Ukraine refugee centers in Central Europe. But I've spent weeks at the border, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, especially over the past 3 years. And I'm going to use statistics to explain some things to you that you are not hearing anywhere else. And what I've discovered, social science, quantitative analysis, I've discovered that a lot of times the numbers you're getting in the news are not correct. So to the extent that the data is available, I have tried to bring that to show that, to give you more of the story. But I also want to share with you the interviews that Chris and I do of federal law enforcement, Border Patrol agents, sheriffs down at the border, residents living at the border, medical professionals, because they tell the true story that our media is not reporting to you. This is an article I wrote a few months ago about the mass surge, a dramatic surge of illegal immigrants from China coming into our country. I've just updated the data. At this time, it was 113,000 under Biden administration only. I've updated it recently. We have had 160,000 Chinese nationals come into our country illegally since Biden took office. Military-aged males. Now, we don't have that data, but it is widely reported by eyewitnesses, myself included, that 80 to 90% of them are military-aged males. Two of the people Chris and I talked to down in Del Rio about 3 months ago, working at the Firefly processing facility down there, it's a Border Patrol soft-sided tent where they process and process and process, because that is the intent of our government right now, to process illegals into the country. That's the whole goal. Two of them, one of which speaks Chinese and is trained in recognizing these things, listened to 3 or 4 that had come in, men, military-aged men, and identified them as military from China. The numbers, and I've had to update the numbers, so please forgive me if I have to, I just want to make sure that my updated numbers I'm remembering correctly. The significance of it is if you look at the previous 10 years, from before Biden took office, we had a total of 15,000 Chinese nationals who had come in here illegally. That is over 10 times the amount in just the past 3 years. As many of you probably know, Chris, my husband, is former counterintelligence in the Army. And he said to me when I found those numbers, he said, you know, that equates to roughly 12 US Army infantry divisions, right? You know, just for fun, let's throw that out there. And then we looked at the PLA, the Chinese People's Liberation Army. We looked at their combined arms brigades, and that equates to 32 combined arms brigades. Now, do I think that all of them are here to sabotage or set up sleeper cells? Of course, all of them are not. But I would like to remind you that 19 people is all it took to kill thousands of Americans on 9/11. Mark Green, who is the chair, and I don't know if I'm, here we go, in case you need that. Yep. So Mark Green, who is the chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security, has said that he has information that does show that some of them that have come in recently are connected to the PLA and to the Chinese Communist Party. We do know that in order to leave China, the CCP knows about it. So I just would like you to, perhaps we don't have conclusions today, but I think we have enough evidence, enough data to be certainly concerned about this. So I would just like to throw out the question, how many of the 160,000 have been sent by the CCP to infiltrate the United States, to spy on our technology centers and on our infrastructure? How many of them are sleeper agents that have been sent here ahead of military action, even if it's decades down the road. Because often if you study China, they think differently in terms of long-term than Americans do. Long-term to us is 5 years, right? But they think differently about that. How many are here to devastate national infrastructure, key utilities, our communications, or maybe to distract us while they invade Taiwan? This is not just yours truly saying these kind of things. There's all kinds of senior security officials that keep bringing this up. Warning, warning, warning. In February, I believe it was, 10 former senior officials from the FBI wrote a letter to Congress to say, we've looked at the patterns of actually they're talking about the Chinese, but also Russians and people coming in illegally from other countries that are adversarial to the United States. Their words were, looking at the patterns, this is purposeful. It is a new and imminent danger. It is an invasion of our homeland, and it is well designed to gain access into the United States. So, what I'm trying to point out here is most Americans know about cybersecurity threat. The Biden administration put in their national security strategy that the Indo-Pacific and the influence of the Chinese government in that area was our greatest national security threat. A lot of people know about intellectual property theft, but I just want to make sure that people know that we have with our, as Chris said, they're not open borders anymore. When we were down here in Del Rio, like I said, about 2 months ago, we realized that there actually are no borders. There were huge gaps in between where Trump's wall was and Abbott's wall, but there were no Border Patrol there, no DPS. But then talking to Border Patrol and DPS, we realized it doesn't matter. Because once illegals are arrested or encountered, taken into custody, they're released per Biden's catch and release. That's what I want people to understand. And as Chris referred to, nobody comes here illegally without the help of the cartels. That means they're being trafficked. And I'm going to explain that in just a moment. I just want to touch very briefly. Chris mentioned about the special interest aliens. So in March of this year, Christopher Wray, FBI director, said to the House and Senate in a hearing that there was a significant surge in the threats of foreign terrorist organizations calling for attacks against us in the United States and against our allies since the October 7th attack of Hamas on Israel. In April, there were other senior intelligence security officials, and I won't go into all of them, warning that we could very likely have another Moscow massacre, which happened, I'm getting my months mixed up, but I believe it was in February, that ISIS-K took responsibility for. Remember that ISIS-K was also responsible for the deadly suicide attacks at Kabul airport. And they now have a sanctuary in Afghanistan because after we pulled out, the Biden administration said we would have over the horizon capability to see what ISIS-K was doing. We do not. We don't know, but we're getting threats from them. So, Chris told you 75,000 special interest aliens have come into the United States, and I'm going to tell you, that was only in the period of 11 months from October 2022 to August 31st, 2023. Special interest aliens refer to people that are coming, looking at their travel patterns, coming from countries that have conditions that favor or harbor terrorism, or perhaps the individuals pose some sort of terrorist or security threat to us. 75,000 in 11 months is a lot. And the only reason we know that, because the CBP does not report this data, is there was a leaked memo from the CBP And I've seen it and substantiated the data, 75,000 in only 11 months. This is a serious number, and we're talking about from countries like Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Afghanistan. I believe it was in that same time period, it might have been a little bit broader. It was almost 7,000 that had come in illegally from Afghanistan. So the terror watch list, Chris already told you we're record numbers there. So there was something that I meant to tell you and I forgot, but the Chinese and other countries that are adversarial to the United States are finding ways to be subtle and insidiously influence and come into the United States. The other way that they're doing that, and I'm referring to the government, not the Chinese people, is through fentanyl. So it is, according to Families Against Fentanyl, you can look at their website, they use CDC data. I looked at it about a year and a half ago and it seemed to me that it was correct, is the #1 killer of people between the ages of 18 and 45. That's over motor accidents, cancer, heart disease, etc. So you can see a very insidious but very influential, very significant infiltration into the United States in that way. And that's something that Chris says the deaths equal to a Boeing 737 of young people crashing every day. So what happens is China sends, and you probably know this, sends the fentanyl to the Mexican cartels who mix it, and it always bears repeating whether you know it or not because a lot of people do not know. They mix it with drugs that are so-called recreational, and people are taking it, and I call it fentanyl poisoning, not overdose, because most of the time they don't know they're taking fentanyl. It takes a very, very small amount, I forget the amount right now, to kill somebody. I've had parents reach out to me and say, thank you for talking about this. I'm pretty sure 2? Yeah, 1 milligram is what I think it is. That's right, thank you. Because they found their child dead after coming home from some party or just hanging out with friends and taking a drug that they thought was Xanax or something like this. It's a very serious problem. Executed by the Mexican drug cartels. 13,000 or 29,000 pounds seized in 2023. That's what didn't get through. And the deaths I know have doubled over the past 3 years. Record number of deaths last year, 2023, somewhere drug overdose was about 111,000. 70% of those were fentanyl related. So, I'll do this very quickly. This is the other thing that you're not hearing about at the border. This is another article that I'd written. The Daily Signal is the Heritage Foundation's publication, and I wrote it for them, but I've written a lot of stories about it. You hear that our immigration at this time is humane, orderly, and safe. Have you heard that before? That's the tagline. Well, because it is not, because we've had a record number of illegal immigrants dying at the border, the Biden administration actually stopped reporting those deaths in the early part of his administration. And I'm very proud that my little organization, Counterpoint Institute, is one of the ones that was down on the border collecting the data, took it back, started reporting it on the media, and forced them to start reporting the number of deaths. In 2022, 865 deaths were reported. Illegals crossing over into U.S., you have it, into U.S. territory. Yep, sorry, Chris. You did great slides, and I'm not even using them. there's data limitations because of the huge desert, the rugged terrain out there. So it's estimated that these deaths are higher. Our Border Patrol and our law enforcement has also engaged in 22,000 rescues in 2022. So 3 times the amount of deaths since 2022. Most of those actually occurred in the Del Rio sector, where we were recently, because most are due to exposure, as you might think, and the second to drowning. In Texas, I have to say, out of the approximately 10 million that we're owning up to that have come in illegally, Texas has taken in almost half of those. So God bless the DPS and the Border Patrol and National Guard that are here. So this is what I wanted to segue into that is rarely reported because nobody wants to talk about it. It's horrible. The percentage of deaths of females actually have tripled since 2018, from 9% of the deaths being female to 27% being female. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we've telegraphed that our borders are open. People are coming to try to make a better life economically, in general, and a lot of times they're not making it. I'll give you one anecdote that will lead me into the next thing. I have many stories that have been told. This was told to me by a Border Patrol agent. I can't, of course, reveal those sources. But he had tried to rescue a young baby, 18-month-old girl that was drowning. He did not rescue her when she was dead when he pulled her out. Oh no, actually, no, I'm mixing that up with another drowning rescue. She was taken to the hospital. She died later, but what they found out at the hospital is that she was brutally, in terms that I can't say right now on polite company, raped by the Mexican cartels, an 18-month-old, while the mother sat in the Border Patrol van saying that she needed more air conditioning. This is a fact at the border, and this is what I want people to understand because I've talked to so many Border Patrol agents and medical professionals, and they're struggling. They're crying, telling me, and I usually cry with them. They're struggling. Border Patrol senior official told me the DUIs, the suicide rates, the domestic violence for the Border Patrol is up because not only are they not allowed to do their jobs, but they're routinely seeing things like this. Another Border Patrol agent told me about picking up 2 women. One had been raped by her traveling partners, the other one shot and killed in the bush. But this, what you have to understand, is this happens constantly. So maybe not, so far inland, but down at the border, and I could tell you stories and stories. There is a formal sex slave trade, right, that the cartels do, bringing children into the United States. And 60% of the children coming from Latin America who are set out to cross the border alone or with smugglers are being used by the cartels for sex trade. And I did verify that data, and now I don't remember where I got it from. This one, it may have been Doctors Without Borders, but I'm sorry, I didn't put it there. But there have been a record number of unaccompanied minors, 152,000 in 2022. So if 60% of those are being used by the cartels, and they do a rinse and repeat with them. Children are repeatedly raped. And you know what, this is the last thing in the world that I thought that I would talk about. I don't like talking about these things, but I'm angry. And things have got to change. It's some of the kids are sold up to 20 times a day. So there is very little data about the sexual assault, but Doctors Without Borders did a study on immigrants coming from the Northern Triangle countries into Mexico and estimated that 1 in 3 of them had been raped. So that gives us some point. But what I want to leave you with is a interview that I did with an emergency service professional that was being used in the Border Patrol Firefly Center in Del Rio. And the thing he said to me is, but Shay, besides the fact, and I'm sorry, I can't talk about it without getting choked up. He said, besides the fact that I have to treat them for the physical issues, he says, I can see the trauma, the brokenness in their eyes. And he's telling me about 13-year-olds, 15-year-olds. They have bracelets on their wrists with barcodes on them so that cartels can track where they are and whether or not they owe more money. So this is something that he brought up to me. What is happening to them? I said, what do you think? He said, they're absorbed into the communities, but there's nothing set up to help them. But he said, they're going to school with my grandchildren. They're in our communities. And I'm going to just read to you his parting remark. He said, for the U.S. government, it's not about stopping it. He said it's about processing illegal immigrants faster, and we will all have to deal with, and this is what I want this crowd to think about, we will have to deal with the consequences of this. Beyond an economic impact, the human trafficking, the sex trafficking of the women and the kids that have come into our country, it's going to have a tremendous psychological and health impact for years and years. So that's what I will leave you with today. Thank you.
Yeah, all right, come to the mic, please. Or here, I'll bring it to you. Yeah, wait, one question. We don't have a lot of time, but while I'm hooking up the laptop for the next...
Could you just comment, please, on the possibility and the reality of the implementation of deporting some of these people that have come in once the administration, God willing, changes?
Yeah. Do you want to start? I do believe it's possible. I think it'll take a decade. Not everybody, of course. I think that we need to start with those on the the special interest alien list, the foreign nationals and that are coming from adversarial countries. I think it'll be a multi-agency process, but I think that we have to do it because of for many of the reasons we've talked about today, and I know you have perspective.
There'll also be a large percentage of self-deportation. Once people here realize it is an inhospitable, hostile environment and that they are subject to stricter law enforcement, they will elect to say, okay, that's it, we're leaving. And that'll be 30% right off the top that will self-deport.
I think so too.
I think stopping the flow of money and helping them out will be help with the self-deportation.
Yeah, there's a great incentive to
Consequences, actually.
to the next
one of those rare
person
things.
who has a different policy view, simply saying to the president of Mexico, if this keeps up, we're going to tariff you at X amount. And you'd be surprised how cooperative they become.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for your work.